I wrote a book called Explanations and Corrections in the Gospel of Luke, and I've already made a bunch of YouTubes about the explanations Luke made and the corrections. Some of those pertain to the book of Daniel. Those are the hardest to explain because people have been brainwashed by traditional interpretations, by Josephus and 1st and 2nd Maccabees, early church fathers, and others. So people are brainwashed and indoctrinated by that, and they're not able to see clearly what Jesus really taught. So I'm going to have two episodes to explain why I think people should not pay any attention to the interpretations of Josephus. So the purpose of this chapter is to discredit Josephus's interpretations of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. If Josephus had never said that the period of the desolation of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes fulfilled Daniel's prophecy, it is possible that later Christian and Jewish commentators would not have relied on 1st and 2nd Maccabees to interpret Daniel. Later commentators might have joined Jerome in acknowledging that 3 years does not equal 3.5 years. Jerome actually said that. Commentators, after being indoctrinated, have become insensitive to the contradiction between the 2 and 3 year periods in these books. And they have become obsessed with the impossible task of finding a 3-year period in Daniel. Many commentators fit the period of the defilement of the temple to a 3.5-year period they see in Daniel chapters 7, 8, and 12. There is no historical support for asserting that the period of defilement during Maccabean times was 1,290 days, 3.5 years, or 1,335 days. But commentators quote certain statements by Josephus in Wars of the Jews, or the Jewish War. In the preface of Wars, section 7, Josephus says, for example, I shall relate how Antiochus, who was named Epiphanes, took Jerusalem by force and held it 3 years and 3 months, and was then ejected out of the country by the sons of Asamoneus. But despite what he said above, Josephus never went on to relate anything about that exact time period, 3 years and 3 months, in either Wars or Antiquities. About a page after his comment about 3 years and 3 months in Wars 111, Josephus says concerning Antiochus Epiphanes, he also spoiled the temple and put a stop to the constant practice of offering a daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. Josephus seems to change 3 years and 3 months to 3 years and 6 months here. He doesn't explain why he did it, and both figures are wrong anyway. Josephus does not even say here that the action by Antiochus fulfilled a prophecy. In Wars 5:9-4, Josephus says, for another example, when Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, lay before the city and had been guilty of many indignities against God, and our forefathers met him in arms, they then were slain in the battle. This city was plundered by our enemies, and our sanctuary made desolate for 3 years and 6 months. But Josephus doesn't tell us that this was a fulfillment of prophecy or what his historical source was for 3.5 years. Josephus changes this time period again in Antiquities. Before quoting him in that book, I'll quote William Whiston, who wrote about Josephus's varying figures for the profanation of the temple. Whiston wrote a list of 51 contradictions between Wars and Antiquities. This is contradiction number 4. And I'll read from a footnote. This is from page 143 of Dissertation upon the Chronology of Josephus, numbered Dissertation IV in Volume 1 of the 1741 Dublin edition of the genuine works of Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian. This same dissertation is numbered Dissertation V, page 970, in the J.S. Vircha 1849 edition of Josephus. The Vircha edition was edited and is easier to read. Now, most of the stuff I'm reading from Josephus you would be able to easily find by just copying part of the quotation and put it in an online search, and you'll find the passage. But the dissertations, this dissertation, is hard to find. I only know of two editions that you'd find it in. Okay, so Whiston says, thus in the first book of the Jewish War, Proem section 7 and book 111 and 594, Josephus thrice ascribes 3.5 years to the profanation of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes. And I'll interject that Whiston is making plenty of mistakes of his own, but I still think substantially what he says is true. While yet in his Antiquities 10 to 7 once and 12 7 6 twice, he honestly owns that it was but 3 years, which last we know to be true from the original historians, the authors of the two books of the Maccabees, 1 Maccabees 1, 54 and 59, with chapter 4, verse 52, and 2 Maccabees 10, verses 3 and 5. See the 6 dissertations, pages 131 and 132. And I have a footnote here that points out that Whiston himself had gotten the numbers confused, the time periods. Whiston says in a footnote on section 2 of the preface to Antiquities, those books of the war were published about AD 75, and these Antiquities AD 93, about 18 years later. Whiston admitted that Josephus made many mistakes and essentially said to ignore wars when it conflicts with Antiquities in the previously mentioned Dissertation IV. The foregoing 51 are the principal examples of such mistakes in Josephus's present copies, as seem to me generally to be his own real mistakes, and not owing to his transcribers or correctors. And the reader will readily observe that they are chiefly confined to the two first books of the Jewish War belonging to elder times, and written when he was comparatively but a young man, under 38 years of age, when he had read comparatively but a few books, and those not always the most authentic. When in particular he appears never to have seen either the first book of Maccabees or the following Chronicle of John Hyrcanus, 1 Maccabees 16, 23 and 24, both written in Hebrew and both the authentic originals, whence he ought to have drawn the principal facts he was to relate, and which accordingly he closely followed and carefully abridged, when, many years afterward, he wrote his Antiquities. As for the 5 books of Jason of Cyrene, or their abridgment, the second book of Maccabees, which were written in Greek, he seems never to have seen them at all. To be sure, he has made little or no use of them, nor is the comparative inaccuracy of Josephus's history in these first parts of his writings to be denied, nor was he himself afterward insensible of it, when in his Antiquities 12:5-2 he begins the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, with whose history his first book of the war, meaning the Jewish war, or wars, had also begun after this manner. I will now relate distinctly, says Josephus, what concerns this king, and how he seized upon Judea and the temple. For when I formerly wrote that history, I mentioned the facts only by way of epitome. Wherefore I think it necessary now to go over that history again, and this after an accurate manner. And greatly does it tend to the honor of Josephus that he was so willing in his latter works to correct the errors of his former, as he appears frequently to have done, though his commentators do hardly ever take notice of it, but instead thereof frequently puzzle and perplex themselves, though generally to little purpose, in reconciling such passages in his following works to the parallel ones in his first, while they ought rather to have acknowledged them to be not seldom plainly irreconcilable, and to have taken particular notice of the latter passages as no other than honest emendations of the former. Nor is it any wonder at all that the Antiquities, published as I said about 18 years after the books of the Jewish War, and his account of his own life, which was an appendix to them, together with 2 books against Appian, which I think were written still later, should be more authentic and more accurate than the earliest of all his writings, the first and second book of the Jewish War. So I don't accept Josephus even in Antiquities, but I say here that I will use Whiston's comments above as an excuse to ignore Josephus's contradictory time periods and wars of the Jews, and to look exclusively at Antiquities of the Jews to determine whether Josephus believed that Daniel prophesied the defilement of the temple during the times of Antiochus. So that's all I have time for in this video, and I'll make another one.